Elkhorn, Montana Territory, October 1885. Nora Callahan had learned over the 6 months since her husband died exactly how to make herself and her daughter invisible in a room. How to move through a place without asking anything of it, and without letting anyone see quite how little they had left to their name, a skill no widow should ever have to learn so thoroughly. She stood just inside the doorway of the dusty Spur Saloon, her cloth bundle held tight against her side. Ida's small hand gripped in hers, both of them trying to cross the room quietly enough that nobody would notice the state of their boots or the thinness of Ida's face. She'd come only to ask Mr. Dunmore, the saloon keeper, whether he had any cleaning work. Anything. She'd have taken anything, scrubbing floors or washing glasses long after closing. And he told her, not unkindly, but not gently either, that he had nothing for her this month, same as he told her the month before. They were nearly to the door when Ida stopped walking, her small boots scuffing to a halt on the worn floorboards, her eyes fixed on something across the room she couldn't quite look away from. Nora followed her daughter's gaze to a table near the window. She didn't need to ask what had caught Ida's eye. She'd run out of ways to explain hunger to a 6-year-old months ago. The rancher looked up. He looked at Ida's face. And then, for a long moment, he looked at Nora's, and something in his expression shifted from simple observation into a decision already half-made, his fork setting down against the plate without him seeming to notice he'd done it. "Ma'am," he said, standing, "would you and your girl care to sit a spell? I ordered more than I can rightly finish, and it'd be a genuine shame to see good food go cold and wasted on a slow afternoon like this one." Nora's husband, Daniel Callahan, had died in April when the mineshaft he'd been working near Elkhorn collapsed on a Tuesday morning, along with 2 other men. All 3 of them buried under rock. The company took 11 days to clear, though everyone in town had known by the 2nd day there'd be no one left alive to find. Mines like that one employed half the men in Elkhorn, drawn by the same silver rush that had given much of Montana Territory its name and its fortune, and buried on average one of them every few years, a risk every family in town understood plainly, long before they lost someone to it themselves. Daniel had known the risk, too, same as every man who took the wage anyway. Because the wage was steady and the alternatives were not, and because a young family needed steady more than it needed safe, he left her with Ida, a small rented house at the edge of town, and debts neither of them had known the full size of until the bank came calling that summer, 3 months after the funeral, when the grief had barely begun to settle into something manageable at all. Money borrowed against the promise of a mining claim that had never paid out. Secured, as it turned out, against the house itself and the one thing of real value Nora owned, the sewing machine her mother had left her, the machine that represented the only trade Nora actually knew well enough to earn a living by. Mr. Abernathy at the Elkhorn Bank had been patient through the summer months, the kind of patience that cost him nothing while the debt continued accruing interest regardless. By October, his patience had run out. He'd given her until the first snow to pay what remained, or the bank would take the house and everything in it, sewing machine included, as settlement. Nora had spent the 6 months since April doing every kind of work Elkhorn would give a widow with a young daughter, laundry, mending, the occasional cleaning job when one came available, and had discovered piece by piece that it added up to just barely enough to keep them fed most weeks, and never enough to touch the debt itself. She had stopped sometime in September eating a full meal herself on the days Ida's portion needed stretching further than the food allowed, telling her daughter she'd already eaten while working. A small, careful lie so practiced by October it hardly felt like lying anymore. Tate Bowen was 28, ran a modest cattle operation 3 miles outside Elkhorn, and had grown up himself with a hunger he remembered clearly enough 20 years later to recognize instantly in someone else's child. His own father had died when Tate was 7, thrown from a horse on a ranch that had gone under within the year, and his mother had raised him and 2 younger sisters on whatever work a widow could find in a territory that didn't offer widows very many honest choices. Tate remembered specific winters with more clarity than he remembered most of his childhood otherwise. The ache of watching his mother claim she wasn't hungry so the portions would stretch further. The shame of a boy's stomach growling in a schoolroom where other children's lunches came wrapped in more than hope. He remembered too the handful of times a neighbor or a teacher had noticed and quietly done something about it, and how those small interventions had never once felt like pity, only like being seen. He built his own ranch slowly since, first as a hired hand, and then by 25 as an owner in his own right, working through winters that would have broken a less stubborn man, and saving every dollar that wasn't strictly needed for the next season's seed and stock. Year after patient year, he'd promised himself somewhere in those hungry years that he would never again sit comfortably in front of a full plate while a child watched him eat it in silence. He hadn't known Nora Callahan's name before that October afternoon. He'd simply seen a 6-year-old girl's eyes fixed on his stew with an intensity that told him everything her mother's careful composure was trying to hide, and had stood up from his table before he'd fully decided to, the decision arriving in his legs before it had finished forming in his mind. Nora's first instinct was to refuse. Her second, watching Ida's eyes, was that refusing on principle wasn't a luxury she had much room left to afford. "That's kind of you," she said carefully, still quite hesitant, "but we don't take charity, Mr. Bowen," he said quietly. "Tate Bowen. And I'd call it charity if I were offering to feed the whole town. Ma'am, I'm offering to share a plate I already paid for and can't finish with a girl who looks like she hasn't eaten today. Seems less like charity and more like not letting good food go to waste." Ida, without waiting for the adults to finish negotiating the matter, had already climbed into the chair nearest the plate, and Nora found herself, despite every instinct toward pride, unable to pull her daughter back out of it. The sight of her small hands already reaching for a biscuit undid every careful argument Nora had been ready to make. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, sitting as well. "We won't make a habit of it." "Didn't ask you to," Tate said plainly, and pushed the plate gently toward the middle of the table, where both of them could reach it, and asked Ida, with the easy patience of a man in no hurry at all, whether she preferred the biscuits with butter or without, as though the whole exchange were simply two friends sharing a meal, rather than anything requiring gratitude at all. Ida answered him, the first full sentence Nora had heard her daughter offer a stranger in many long months. And Nora watched her daughter's shoulders come down from around her ears for the first time since April. She hadn't realized until that exact moment how much she'd needed someone else to notice, too. Around them, the saloon continued its ordinary afternoon business, nobody else in the room paying the small table by the window any special mind at all, which Nora found unexpectedly to be its own kind of mercy. Tate found reasons over the following weeks to have mending done. Torn work shirts, a saddle blanket that needed patching, curtains for a ranch house that had gone without proper curtains since his mother passed 2 winters back, and paid Nora a fair wage for every piece of it, always in advance, always without comment on whether the work strictly needed doing. Nora noticed the pattern within the second week and said nothing about it, understanding it for the careful kindness it was rather than pointing out how thin the pretense had worn, grateful if she was honest with herself that he'd found a way to help that let her keep something to show for it besides charity. Nora took the work because refusing it would have meant refusing money Ida needed, and told herself the arrangement was purely practical, even as she found herself taking more care than the mending strictly required, even as Ida began asking on the mornings Nora delivered finished work to the Bowen ranch whether she could come along. Tate taught Ida to feed the chickens on those visits, and to recognize which of his horses were gentle enough for a small girl's hand, and which needed a wide berth. And Ida began arriving at the ranch with the plain eagerness of a child who has found somewhere she's allowed to simply be a child rather than a careful, quiet extension of her mother's worry. She hasn't laughed like that since her father died, Nora told him one afternoon, watching Ida chase a barn cat across the yard with unrestrained delight. Children generally know a safe place when they find one, Tate said. Reckon it's a skill grown folks lose somewhere along the way, worrying too much to trust it plainly. Mr. Abernathy came to Nora's door himself in early November, 3 weeks earlier than his original deadline, and informed her, with the regret of a man who has decided regret costs him nothing, that a shortfall in the bank's own accounts meant the deadline was arriving considerably sooner than either of them had planned. "I've collected less than half what's owed," Nora said, standing in her own doorway with Ida half hidden behind her skirts, listening carefully to every single word passing between the two adults. "I need more time. I've worked every day since April, Mr. Abernathy. I haven't asked for a single day's grace beyond what you already gave me." "I've given you since April," Abernathy said, not unkindly, though the effect was the same as if he had been. "The bank's patience isn't unlimited, Mrs. Callahan. Whatever sympathy I might feel personally for your circumstances, I'll need the house and the machine both by the end of next week, or I'll be forced to send the sheriff to collect them, and I'd rather not do that in front of your girl if it can be avoided." Ida hadn't eaten her breakfast that morning. Nora told Tate later, too worried about her mother's quiet crying the night before to manage even a bite. And Tate rode into town that same afternoon and sat across from Mr. Abernathy's desk with a directness that left no room for the banker's usual careful hedging, his hat still in his hand, dust from the ride still on his boots. "What's the full amount owed?" Tate said. "And what would it take to convince the bank that a widow with a growing dress-mending trade is a better investment than a foreclosed house nobody in Elkhorn currently has cash to buy?" She found out about Tate's visit to the bank before he'd had the chance to tell her himself, Elkhorn being the kind of town where news outran the people carrying it, and it arrived at his ranch that evening with her jaw set in a way Tate had learned over the past month meant an argument was coming. "You had no right," she said before he'd finished rising from his chair. "That debt is mine to settle, Tate, not yours to solve quietly behind my back like I'm a problem needing managing." "Wasn't trying to manage you," Tate said firmly. "Was trying to keep a roof over your daughter's head, which seemed more urgent than whose pride got bruised settling it." "My pride is the only thing I've had left to hold on to since April," Nora said, her voice catching despite her effort to keep it steady. "I've taken in laundry. I've gone without meals so Ida wouldn't have to. I have done everything a person can do with dignity intact. And I won't have you erase all of that by simply solving it for me because it was faster than watching me finish the work myself. You don't know what it costs a person to hold on to that little bit of control when everything else has already been taken." Tate was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "You're right," he said. "I should have asked you first. I got scared of Ida losing her home, and I acted on that fear instead of respecting that this was your fight to finish, however you chose to finish it. I'm sorry for that." He paused, turning his hat over once in his hands before setting it down entirely. "What I told Abernathy wasn't an offer to pay your debt outright. It was an offer to help you prove what your work is actually worth to a man who only understands numbers. That decision's still yours. I should have brought it to you before I brought it to him." Nora sat with that a long moment, some of the anger draining out of her at the plainness of the apology, the kind that didn't try to explain itself out of being wrong. "Show me what you told him," Nora said finally. "And then we do the rest of it together, or not at all. I don't want the debt paid outright. I want work, real work, steady enough to pay it down myself on my own schedule, with my own two hands and nobody else's charity mixed in with it." Neither of them knew it yet, but the following week would test that promise in front of the entire town, with no storm to hide behind and nothing left to blame but the numbers themselves. The sheriff arrived at Nora's door exactly 1 week later. Mr. Abernathy stepped behind him with a folded paper in hand, and Nora stood in her own doorway with Ida's hand gripped tight in hers, watching a stranger prepare to carry her mother's sewing machine out into the street in front of half the neighborhood already gathering to watch, drawn by how efficiently bad news traveled in a town that size. "I've come to collect what's owed, Mrs. Callahan," Abernathy said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who had already decided the matter was settled well before he'd ever ridden out to her door that morning. "I gave you every fair chance the bank's patience allowed." "You gave her a chance to fail," Tate said, arriving at a hard trot and swinging down before his horse had fully stopped moving, a leather folder held tight under one arm. "Not a fair one. Look at what's actually in front of you before you send a man into a widow's house." He handed Abernathy the folder, a stack of signed orders from 6 ranch wives across the county, each one committing to steady mending and dressmaking work through the coming year, the kind of guaranteed income no foreclosed house sitting empty through a Montana winter could match. That's more reliable income than half the loans this bank's currently carrying on its own books, Tate said. Restructure the debt against it, spread across 2 years instead of demanding it all at once, and you collect every dollar owed with interest besides. Or you can seize a sewing machine worth a fraction of what it's owed against, and a house nobody in this county has the cash to buy from you this winter. Abernathy studied the folder for a long moment, the whole street silent around him, Ida's hand still tight in her mother's, the sheriff himself shifting uncomfortably at having become the center of a scene nobody in it particularly wanted to be part of. "This is your work," Abernathy said finally, looking at Nora directly rather than at Tate, not his. "It's mine," Nora said firmly. "Every stitch of it." Mr. Bowen only gathered what was already true and put it where you'd have to look at it plainly. Abernathy folded the papers closed slowly, the whole street still watching, waiting. "My own mother took in washing after my father died," he said, quiet enough that only those nearest heard it. "I was younger than your girl. I've spent 20 years in banking telling myself numbers don't care whose hands did the work behind them. Perhaps that's the part I've been getting wrong." He looked at the sheriff. "We're not collecting today. I'll have the restructured terms drawn up by Monday, Mrs. Callahan. 2 years, same rate, secured against the income in this folder instead of your machine." The sheriff touched his hat and left without a word. The small crowd that had gathered began slowly to disperse, several of the ranch wives who'd signed those orders stopping to squeeze Nora's hand on their way past. Nora stood in her own doorway a long moment after the street had emptied, Ida finally letting go of her hand to chase after a neighbor's dog, and found herself, for the first time in 7 months, standing on ground nobody was actively trying to take from her. "You should have asked me before you built that folder, too," she told Tate, though without much heat left in it. "Asked Mrs. Pewitt and the others myself, with your name on every line," Tate said. "But I brought it to you before I ever walked it into that bank. Reckon that was the part I'd learned to get right this time." She found him mending fence the following week, the debt settled and restructured, the whole ordeal finally behind them. The question she'd been avoiding all autumn had answered itself somewhere in the space of that single tense afternoon, the folder of contracts still sitting on her kitchen table where she'd left it, a physical reminder of exactly what her own 2 hands had already built before anyone stepped in to help her prove it. "I want to set up a proper shop in town," she told him. "Not just mending taken in at the kitchen table. A real trade with my name on the sign, built on exactly what that folder proved was already true." "It'll do well," Tate said, setting down the wire cutters. "Half the county already knows your work's worth paying for." "Is that all you have to say about it?" Nora asked. "No," Tate said. "I've spent 2 months watching you hold your whole world together with nothing but stubbornness and a sewing needle, and I'd like the chance to spend considerably longer than 2 months doing it alongside you instead of just admiring it from a distance. That's a business proposal, and something else besides, if you'll have both." Nora looked at this man who'd learned in the space of a single argument exactly how to help without taking over, who'd waited for her to choose rather than deciding for her. "Yes," she said. "I'll have both." They married in January once the debt was fully settled and the worst of the winter had passed, in a small ceremony at the Elhorn Church with half the county in attendance, including Mr. Abernathy, who told anyone who asked that he'd simply made a sound business decision, though he never quite managed to explain when pressed why he'd stood at the back of the church that day looking considerably more moved than a sound business decision usually left a man looking. Nora opened her dress shop that spring in a small storefront on Elhorn's main street, built on the same 6 contracts Tate had once carried into the bank in a leather folder, and grew the trade steadily from there, hiring a second seamstress within the first year, a widow herself, and making a quiet point of paying a fair wage without ever once making the woman feel pitied for needing it. Within 2 years, Nora was the shop every ranch wife in the county mentioned first when asked where to have a dress properly made. Ida grew up largely at the Bowen Ranch, calling Tate Papa within the year without anyone having asked her to, and never again went to bed hungry a single night in her life, a fact Tate made quietly, permanently certain of every single day without ever once making a show of it. She learned to ride by the time she was 8, and to sew nearly as well as her mother by 10, carrying pieces of both of them forward in equal measure. Nora kept framed on the wall of her shop the first receipt Tate had ever paid her for mending a torn work shirt. 3 cents worth of thread. Not because the amount mattered, but because it marked, she told customers who asked, the exact day someone had first noticed her working hard enough to deserve to be paid for it properly, rather than pitted for needing the money at all. 20 years before Tate ever met Ida, he was the hungry kid nobody noticed fast enough. That's the detail that actually breaks something open in this story. Not the folder full of contracts, not even the plate of stew. Just a man finally getting to be, for somebody else's child, the person he'd needed at 7 years old and never quite got in time. Nora spent 6 months insisting she needed nothing from anyone, and she wasn't wrong to insist on it. Pride, held on to carefully, was sometimes the only thing keeping a person upright when everything else had already been taken from them. But the thing that actually saved her wasn't Tate rescuing her from a debt. It was Tate learning, in the space of one hard conversation, the difference between solving a problem for someone and standing beside them while they solved it themselves, a lesson plenty of well-meaning people never manage to learn at all, no matter how many times life gives them the chance to. Ida got a father who remembered hunger well enough to make sure she never had to. Nora got a partner who learned the first time he got it wrong exactly how to get it right the second time. That's not a small thing, in a man or in a story. Most people never learn that lesson at all.